Your second article is exactly trying to explain why homicides are so high in Latin America. So maybe we can go through some of the topics you covered in this article.
So I think when studying every society, it's really important to have a historical perspective. And so a really distinguishing feature of Latin America, of course, one is recognizing the indigenous history. And of course, that had lots of violence, right? So when the conquistadors came, there were many warring groups fighting between themselves. So colonialism did not invent violence, but it certainly fueled an impunity because the white Europeans had a improved technology, and that enabled them to seize the most valuable territories, the most valuable land, and then entrench a level of impunity. So they established haciendas, they established encomiendas, they established plantations, whereby that white European elite created what Acemoglu calls extractive institutions. So they created institutions that consolidated their wealth and their political power, and then they could exercise unchecked violence. I think it's striking that in Brazil, for example, it was only in 1988 that they removed the literacy requirement for voting. So that's an example of whereby a privileged elite entrenches its own dominance. So you always had that wealth concentration in Latin America, and that accelerated over the 20th century, whereby the wealthy industrialists and the rich landowners, they were able to push and control the government to develop policies that favored their own interests, right? So I'm a rich landowner, I want all the policies to benefit me. And what that saw is a rise in inequality over the 20th century. And it also thwarted Latin America's development because instead of having pro-labor industrialization and job-creating economic growth, in fact, the benefits were rigged towards the elites. That created a system of inequality, and those rich elites were also able to evade taxes. So Latin America today has relatively low direct taxes, that the elites don't pay so much tax. So that also reduces the state capacity. That also reduces whether you've got an effective state. Very nice paper by Soares and Naratomi. They show that if you compare Latin America to other countries, other regions, you'll find two distinguishing features of Latin America. One, the high inequality, but also relative to the level of violence, not many police, not many judges. So there's relatively weak state capacity. So as part of this inequality, if the elites aren't paying their fair share of taxes, then this means that the poorest people have a strong incentive. If you don't believe that you can get up through honest means, if you don't believe that you can get a decent job and buy a house and provide for your family, you may think, hey, there's a nice guy down the road who's owning a nice car, maybe I'll take that car for myself. And if there is no effective policing to stop you from doing so, anyone would seize that opportunity, right? So as a consequence of inequality and ineffective police, or a weak police, then that one figured. So inequality and a weak police presence, that's super important. On top of this, Soares in more recent work shows that Brazil's commodity boom, the oil boom in oil-rich regions over the 2000s, when there was an oil price boom, what that meant is it increased inequality, it increased the earnings of skilled workers, it increased the capital to the owners of capital, but it didn't do much for the poorest people. And even though the local municipal governments were collecting more taxes and were investing more in public education, public services, Soares find that it didn't lead to any improvements. So even though there was more investment in public services and public education, the rate of secondary education didn't actually improve. The rate of the police effectiveness didn't actually improve. So it seems like it's not just a function of how much the Brazilian government spends, but whether it's able to have an effective state. So it could just be that there's a lot of corruption. It could be that the government is spending a lot of money on hiring personnel, on expanding the size of the state, but not actually delivering any benefits for anyone. So those are a couple of things. But basically, if you have, a rise in inequality, but not an effective state, then there is every incentive to loot and seize all these opportunities. And so we certainly see that comparing across Latin American countries where the state is weak, where the state is ineffective, we also see drug wars. So there's a wonderful book by Deborah Yasha, and she basically argues that a lot of the homicides in Latin America are basically rival drug gangs fighting over territory. So where you have places, for example, in northern Mexico, where you don't have a strong state presence, or in parts of the border regions in northern Brazil, where the state is weak, that's where the drug gangs go because that's the valuable territory to traffic drugs. And then when the two sides compete, it's always the competition between criminals is what fuels the violence. And like you can see that very clearly if you look at Rio de Janeiro versus Sao Paulo, right? Where you have lots of criminal gangs competing, that's where you have more violence. So that's one point. So again, is this underlying theme that you've got a weak state and you've got competition to make money. On top of that, there's a really nice paper highlighting that when the Brazilian government shifted to firing up planes after 2005, they started a process of targeting the planes traveling with drugs. Then the drug traffickers thought, okay, where is the state weaker? Let's go into the Amazon. And then what happened is the police followed them into the Amazon. But of course, communities live on the ground. And so that caused an escalation of violence. Here's a really big problem. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. Like I was saying earlier with when they improved the state security in Colombia and it went to Ecuador. So when the Brazilian government started targeting the skies and the planes, the drug traffickers went down to the ground and that exposed all those vulnerable communities. So that's another problem, that even if control over the terrain could improve, if you've got international traffickers responding to the US and European demand for drugs, then the criminals may just jump ship.